There's no conversation. You know, the door's opening and they're being met with lead being fired out of a gun.
Stand back!
He was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Silhouetted subject was seen running away.
He said, if I don't get it, I'm gonna effing kill you.
When did you realize that the person that you were hired to kill was not the person that you killed?
Amanda Canellis has a babysitter for the week. Her younger sister, 24-year-old Alicia.
Hey. Hey.
Alicia was definitely that person who would give you the shirt off her back. There's not a lot that she wouldn't do for someone that she cared about.
Thanks for doing this.
Oh, I get to spoil the kids.
It was kind of all hands on deck since I was going to be gone for a number of days.
All right, you know the rules.
It was an annual work meeting in New York.
I'm serious, okay? They're all settled. Hey, Alicia.
Typically, the nanny usually only worked during the daytime, and so I needed other people to help out. Alicia loved being an auntie, and she would even request to take the kids. They had a great time with her. She had all these animals. She was such an animal lover. Dogs, chickens, a tortoise, just, you know, the list goes on and on. Her life was going really well. She had just gotten married in July to her not only high school sweetheart, these guys had known each other since elementary school. The wedding was on the beach. The sun was shining. It was exactly what she wanted, and it was perfect.
Okay. Have a good flight. Bye.
Bye.
Love you. Love you more.
911, what is location of your emergency?
Everett, Washington. I heard two pops and it woke me up. She is lying in her own blood.
What's her name?
Alicia McGuire. I am scared to open the door.
911, what is the emergency?
I don't know what happened, but there were potentially gunshots.
Did you see anything, or?
Yes. I saw them run down the driveway. They were dressed all in black.
It was a deceased female who had been shot. Silhouetted subject was seen running away. Our phones, our email, everything starts getting ringed. Sounds like, you know, like the world's ending.
All right, let's go.
Snohomish County Sheriff's Department.
She's against the door.
All right, let's push on. Stand back!
They're having to make the house safe to make sure there's nobody in there that's going to hurt them or anybody else.
They had learned that there were children in the house.
They don't know what's going on. Strange people are in the homes. There's people crying. This is a horrific event.
Police call in homicide detectives Ted Betts and Eric Fagan.
What you got? Hispanic female, mid-20s, multiple gunshot wounds.
The most important thing at that point was to start following the evidence. I saw fired cartridge casings on the ground around the vehicle that was parked immediately in front of the front door. This shooter appeared to have fired from outside of the doorway. However, there were also fired cartridge casings inside the threshold of the door.
Look here. You can see some bullet strikes or defects in the door frame. We knew from the patrol briefing they had seen some bullet strikes into the banister.
There's blood on the outside of the door. Alicia's body was immediately behind the door.
There was no signs or evidence that would be consistent with the robbery. Nothing seemed to be missing or, disturbed or overturned.
Because it was her sister's house, was there a possibility that this is mistaken identity? Was it supposed to be Alicia, or was it supposed to be Amanda? This was something we needed to investigate.
Detectives turned to Amanda's live-in nanny, who dialed 911 to see if she can provide any clues.
Can you tell me what happened?
She was very emotional. She had a hard time holding it together. She was upstairs when the shots rang out, and when she looked downstairs, she saw Alicia's body lying on the floor.
What can you tell us about Alicia?
Was there any problem between Alicia and her husband? Was there anything that could lead us to believe that her husband might be involved? During the course of our interview with the nanny, we learned that there were no problems between Alicia and her husband. However, there were problems between her sister, Amanda, and her estranged husband, Kevin Lewis, who did not live in that house. And that piqued our interest. There was a deputy who remembered actually responding to that address previously, and that there had been previous domestic violence incidents at that residence.
Detectives find an address for Amanda's estranged husband on the other side of Everett.
It's roughly 5 o'clock in the morning now when we're over at Kevin Lewis's home. The house seems to be fairly dark. Kevin opens the door. He was wearing a white tank top, and then I also remember he had a sleep mask kind of on across his forehead.
Kevin, can I speak with you for a minute? Can you tell me where you've been tonight?
At home. Sleeping.
He was home all night long, had never left the home. He didn't have any guests and visitors, and nobody was coming and going from the place.
There's been an incident at your ex-wife's house.
Okay.
When they told him that there had been a shooting there in a house where his young children are, he didn't seem to be too shook up by it. That was odd.
Detectives look for any surveillance cameras that might confirm Kevin's movements that night.
We found a couple. One was right next door to Mr. Lewis's residence. Another one was just a couple houses down.
They return to the police department and wait for the CCTV to come in.
Got the footage.
Let's start at about an hour before the 911 call.
Cameras affixed on the corner of the home, kind of above the front door porch area.
All right, let's fast forward a little bit.
There.
We see the headlights of a car come in. That car reverses backward, just stops right at the base of Kevin's driveway.
Now, this is 1:10 in the morning, and a car just stays there.
Ten seconds go by, then 30 seconds go by. You're just looking for some sort of movement.
There. Top left.
Rewind. Punch in.
Now it's that 112 mark. You have a subject coming out of the door.
It is 40 minutes before Alicia is murdered.
It's a little bit dark and grainy, but you can still see some movement. It looks as if the person that's come out of the front door is wearing a white tank top. Very consistent with what Kevin was wearing.
Is he getting in the car?
We couldn't say at that point that that was Mr. Lewis because the video wasn't that good, but it sure looked like Mr. Lewis.
He said he'd never left for the night. He said he never had visitors.
Why would he lie to us about that?
Punch in on the car.
Detectives look for details to identify the vehicle.
You don't get to see the car in any really good detail from this camera.
Let's swap to the other camera.
It's a little bit closer to the road. This car leaving Kevin's home. It's a light color, maybe silver.
We could see general identifying features of the vehicle, but we couldn't tell exactly what kind of car it was.
Okay, I'm gonna take it back to when it arrives.
Wait. Look through the wheel.
The front right tire, the metal rim, is dark in color. Those other three rims, they're all light in color. So on a minimum, we now know that we have something at least slightly unique.
I'll get a bolo out. Get screen grabs out to traffic.
It was such a nondescript vehicle. It was a 1,000-to-1 shot.
They fast forward to see if the car returns later on.
Here it is.
The car returns over 20 minutes later.
It is now 1:33 a.m., 20 minutes before the 911 calls came in.
Someone who appears to be Mr. Lewis gets out of the car and walks back into the house. And then this car leaves, and we don't ever see it again. It doesn't show up on camera again.
It's about a 12 to 15-minute drive time from Kevin's house to where Amanda lives.
There was ample time for that car to have driven from Kevin's house to Amanda's house. However, the car returned before the first 911 call of a shooting at 1:53-ish. He wasn't there at the time of the shooting unless he went out the back door and got another ride, but there was no evidence of that. If he didn't go anywhere that night, then, you know, we are set back again. We don't know who else to look at.
It wasn't until several hours after she'd been killed that I learned about it.
Dad?
I was in New York, and my dad called. He said, Amanda. And just the way he said my name, I knew something was bad. And I hear the words just like it just happened. I think about those words all the time because of how much pain my dad was in. She was planning to have a baby. Her life was going very well until it was cut short.
Back at the crime scene, investigators search for more clues.
They're taking measurements to gauge the angle in which the bullets strike objects. They're using what's called trajectory rods.
I was able to see that the trajectory rod pointed at the corner of the garage.
Someone had been hiding behind the corner there, and those appeared to be the initial shots.
There's no communication, there's no conversation. You know, the door's opening and she's being met with lead being fired out of a gun.
What it also tells us is that we're also looking for a second individual. Because if there's someone standing at the corner of the garage firing the gunshots, how in the heck did that happen without someone being there to knock on the door? The shell casings that were found outside showed that this individual had moved closer towards the doorway.
The bullet wounds on Alicia's head were fairly close range.
That shooter just reached in and was able to get the muzzle of the gun very close to the head where it, you know, delivered a fatal shot.
That indicates a much stronger intent to kill. The science was showing us that this was a targeted attack. And there's nothing in Alicia's life that showed that she should be targeted for anything. When I looked at the fired cartridge casings at the scene, I recognized the brand. They were Talamo.
Well, hey, this isn't a very common brand, so perhaps if it's not common, we can figure out where it's sold locally. And if that's the case, then maybe if we get lucky, we figure that out, get video. You know, now we can find somebody buying that.
I'm just wondering if you've sold any 9mm Talamo ammo.
We found a Walmart that was not too far away, so we made a request to look for purchases of this kind of ammunition.
Well, you have. Yeah, we'll be right there.
When I got the information from the Walmart that a male had purchased some 9mm Talamo ammunition, I was excited. I was thinking, man, you know, could it be that we got something here?
Detectives head to Walmart to view their surveillance video from the time of the purchase.
So, the 18th at 4:39. There.
Could it be we struck pay dirt and we got evidence that someone that purchased this stuff?
Wait. Pause right there, please.
His ammunition is being purchased.
Zoom in, right there.
Unfortunately, the quality of the video wasn't the very best.
Can we still figure out who this is, and is there some connection to anyone else that have come up in this case?
There was a card that was used. So we had a name to go by. And so that was the next logical step, was to start researching that name.
Ted, I got nothing. I checked everything. There's nothing.
There was no clear connection of this gentleman to, the babysitter, to Alicia, to Amanda, to Kevin, to any of the names.
The man seen buying the ammo is no longer a suspect.
Nobody likes to strike out, but then the reality was, what other evidence do we have now?
With all other leads drying up, detectives turned to Amanda for more information on Kevin.
When I looked into the reported incidents between Kevin and Amanda, it became apparent that there was a progression of violence.
Can you tell me about your relationship with your ex-husband?
I started to see some of Kevin's controlling behavior during the honeymoon. I didn't realize that he was spiraling. The biggest injury was a laceration to my face on my eyebrow, forehead area, and you could see the bone. So after the second assault, I filed the protection order, which granted me custody of the kids. Kevin would call me regularly and try to ask me to come back home. And he said, I'm going to take you to court and file for full custody, alimony, and child support. And if I don't get it, I'm going to effing kill you.
Amanda, did Kevin know that you were going to be away?
All of this pointed towards a misidentification. Amanda fervently believed that she was the one who was supposed to have been there. She believed that she should have been the one who answered that door. Alicia was at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Detectives re-watched the CCTV from outside Kevin's house for any more clues he could be involved.
We don't have the information that says Kevin was involved. The video has him at his house at the time that the homicides occurred.
You can't make pieces fit that don't fit. You have to follow your evidence. We have what appear to be two provable lies. One, there was a visitor, and two, he did leave the house.
If you're lying about leaving, there's a reason. And is that reason because he showed somebody where Amanda's house was?
Take it back. There.
It looked as if he got into the rear driver's side of the vehicle. Why not get into the front passenger seat? Could there be two people in the car? Because clearly someone's driving the car away. So is it just one person? Is there two?
It fits with the ballistics evidence, which suggests that two people were involved in Alicia's shooting. Wanting to protect Amanda from Kevin, investigators begin to gather evidence on the assaults.
By November of 2018, he was found guilty of 2 different felonies, assaults upon Amanda, and he was sentenced to 3 years. But Alicia's case wasn't solved, and Amanda only has a guarantee of maybe 3 years, maybe a little less with good time. The case was getting pretty cool at that point. We hadn't seen anything that could really help us identify the car yet. There were no witnesses to identify anybody. There was nothing. We got 2 tips from 2 different women in Spokane who talked about a woman who was getting loose lips at some type of pool party.
Okay.
This girl was talking about having committed this homicide with another guy, and that the victim had been shot in the head. Now, the victim had been shot. That was publicized, but not where she had been shot. And that they were hired by a baby daddy.
Name given to us of the young gal that was bragging about doing the murder was Angelica Kendall.
Detectives suspect this could be a fake name.
I'm looking into the Angelica's social media accounts. There's about a dozen different platforms that I know are hers because a lot of the same photos are being used.
Ted, I think I'm onto something.
He found out just one tiny little post about Angelica's real name, Alexis Hale.
They searched through images and videos posted by Alexis around the time of the murder.
Look at this.
The pistol she was holding in these photographs was a Hi-Point C9 pistol. We believe that's what fired the fatal bullets.
Look at this.
She is videoing someone in a mirror. So you see her pointing the camera, and he's on his phone, and he's vaping and looking at something on his phone. One of our tipsters mentioned that Alexis spoke of being with a boyfriend, and we ended up getting a name, and that name was Jaredon Phelps.
Wait, what's this?
On the night Alicia was murdered, Alexis took a video using her phone through the windshield of the car.
Kind of bragging about a trip or being somewhere.
Rewind a couple seconds. There. The sign.
And I was able to get a known location by the street sign.
It put them within a minute of the video from the neighbor of Kevin's house showing that car arrive.
Take a look at this.
One of the videos we got was recorded at 3:47 in the morning of September 20th. So this would have been after Alicia's murder. And this video portrayed Jaredon, named Jay, on social media with a handful of $100 bills, $20 bills, and he's fanning them in front of this camera. That was hugely important because the tipster said they were hired and paid roughly $2,000. Eric and I were able to count just a little bit more than that in Jay's hand.
With Jay, I am able to then find some stuff on Facebook. So then kind of went through some of those posts and found a photo. That picture has, 5 different comments on it. One of them comes from an aunt of Jay. And when I get into her photos, I immediately recognized that lady as Kevin Lewis's mother.
That's crazy.
When we finally made the connection that he turned out to be Kevin Lewis's cousin, it was just a jaw-dropping moment. We got photos of Jay's car from Google Earth. His car was parked in front of his residence when the Google car drove by, but it had this odd wheel. Holy smokes, that is Jay's car.
We have enough now to make an arrest in this case.
When the time came to make the arrest, being out of our own jurisdiction, we got to reach out to the local municipalities and the sheriff's office, get additional resources. You got to figure out, who you want to go arrest first.
Investigators find an address for Alexis, 300 miles away in Spokane.
We chose Alexis because I felt that being a juvenile, she'd already run her mouth once, she might do it again.
Get off of me! Get off!
There was some screaming going on. You can't arrest me. I'm a juvenile. You can't do this. She was very tight-lipped and immediately asked to speak with her attorney.
She clearly knew what we were there for and why, and then really just shut down, became very cold.
With Alexis refusing to talk, detectives tracked down Jaredon at an address an hour south of Everett.
It was important to have him tell me who hired him, who put him up to this. We had already dealt with Alexis. She gave us nothing. So our only shot was going to be with Jay.
You've got a long life ahead of you. You're in trouble right now, but how much is going to be up to you. I've been in your social media. I know a lot of things that you don't know that I know. I know about the money. I know about you flashing the money. So I know about all that stuff. And I know who got you into it, but I need you to voice it to me.
I mean, it seems like you got a pretty good story put together. We know what you're talking about.
Okay. Who was the person that put you into this?
Yeah, I just don't know how much me telling you what you don't already know. It's not gonna help me.
If a person is not wanting to be honest, if they're not wanting to provide any information, then the legal system is going to be less likely to offer you any kind of leniency.
Well, I'm offering different ways for him to tell me, and I was getting nowhere with him.
When did you realize that the person that you were hired to kill was not the person that you killed?
Wait, what?
When did you realize that the person that you were hired to kill was not the person that you actually killed?
I didn't realize.
The person you were hired to kill was not home that night. Her sister was babysitting the kids. If I were to put out a picture of the person who led you into this, would you be willing to pick them out? No? Okay, that's fine.
There was nothing that was helping us. I was striking out.
You find a family member and you set them up to do this while you sit at home. And then the likelihood of them getting caught is pretty high. He set you up. Straight up, set you up. Don't cover for him. It hurts you. That's my advice. You know and I know we're talking about the same person, don't we? Let's get out in the open. What's his name? Why won't you give me his name? Because that's the honesty part I want out of you.
If we both know who it is, what difference does it make?
Now, if you don't want to tell me his name, that's fine. I'm not going to hit you up for it anymore.
His name is Kevin.
I was dumbstruck. I was thinking, that didn't actually work, did it? I knew that this was going to be a pivotal moment where he's going to start giving up more information. Jaredon agreed to go back to the scene with us in my truck, and Eric recorded him as he was speaking to me.
When I initially took Kevin here, he just showed me where the house was, and I turned around and I was taking him back to his home.
Okay, so now when you come back,
wow,
where did you park?
Right there, sir.
He really was able to, on scene, dial in some of those details even more.
Now, when you, where you were standing, you see the numbers on the corner there?
Yeah.
Were you standing about in that area there?
Yep, right there.
Okay. When Lexi knocked on the door,
yep,
how far did the door get open?
It wasn't very far. She peeked her head out, and as Lexi was walking towards us, her back was to the door, the woman was looking at Lexi, and then I came around the corner, and it took her maybe, I want to say by the third or fourth shot, I felt like I was shooting the door. She closed the door, and then I opened it back up, and then I think I let 2 more off, and then I want to say she closed the door again.
You just run at that point?
I ran.
The trajectory rods, the measurements, the autopsy, and all of the shell casings that were found at the scene, everything matched up almost exactly.
The following day, Eric and I went to the Snohomish County Jail, and we saw Kevin. And I told him that we were investigating Alicia's death, and I asked him if he wanted to talk to us about it. He didn't want to talk to us.
We know everything.
We had Jay's picture. That sent a bolt of lightning down his spine, but he wasn't going to show that to us.
Detectives finally have enough evidence to charge Kevin Lewis with Alicia's murder.
We had Jaredon Phelps testifying on our behalf. We had all of the social media evidence. We had the surveillance video. We had everything that we needed to prove it at trial.
In 2020, Jaredon Phelps and Alexis Hale plead guilty to first-degree murder. Jaredon is sentenced to 31.5 years. Alexis receives 15 years. In 2022, Kevin Lewis is found guilty of first-degree aggravated murder and conspiracy to commit murder. He is sentenced to life.
This case will never leave my memory to my dying day. The video evidence in this case was hugely important.
It helps police piece together the events leading up to Alicia's murder. Jaredon and Alexis drive from Spokane to Kevin's house in Everett. Kevin then shows them where Amanda lives and pays them to kill her.
After having gone on a reconnaissance trip with Kevin Lewis and taken him back home, they returned and they approached to the door of Amanda's house. And while Jay is hiding around the corner, Alexis knocks on the door.
Hello? Excuse me, where are you?
She was shot several times, and she still shut the door. She just used every last bit of her dying, her last breath to try to protect the kids. I miss her laugh. It was unique and infectious. I miss arguing with her.
The bitter winter wind howling off Lake Michigan in January 1978 didn't just freeze the Chicago streets. It crystallized a lie that would breathe silently behind the drywall of a Lincoln Park brownstone for nearly half a century. In the early morning hours of January 14th, amidst a historic blizzard that paralyzed the entire metropolitan area, 19-year-old art student Diane Vance vanished from the second-floor apartment she shared with her classmate and roommate, a quiet young woman named Absolute Silence. When the police finally breached the heavy oak door 3 days later, they found a disturbing scene frozen in time, a record still spinning on the turntable, 2 cups of coffee gone cold on the kitchen counter, and a massive smear of arterial blood slashing across the floral wallpaper of the master bedroom, but no bodies, no weapons, and no sign of forced entry. The roommate, 20-year-old Cindy Structural Ghost, was instantly classified by an overwhelmed, old-school detective bureau as a missing person, a secondary victim who had likely been abducted alongside Diane by a brutal, migratory predator operating under the cover of the whiteout. For 40 long years, that assumption stood as an unshakable truth, a tragic cold case file gathering soot in the subterranean archives of the Area 3 homicide headquarters. The community carried the trauma as a collective scar, telling themselves that the girls were buried deep beneath the concrete foundations of the expanding highway system or dropped through the cracked winter ice of the Chicago River. But the darkness didn't travel down the interstate. It didn't leave the block. It moved precisely 12 inches to the left, settling comfortably into the adjacent apartment unit where a reclusive, gentle eccentric named Arthur Pendleton built a 40-year life of pristine anonymity while looking out his front window at the exact same street corner Diane had loved. It took a microscopic breakthrough in high-density forensic vacuum harvesting and genetic genealogy to finally break the seal on that brownstone wall, exposing a psychological horror that defied every established rule of modern criminal profiling and shattered the structural sanity of the neighborhood. The physical terrain of the Area 3 Investigative Archive in 1978 was a chaotic wilderness of paper logs, Polaroid snapshots losing their color, and primitive blood typing kits that were entirely useless against the massive environmental contamination caused by a broken steam pipe in the apartment building's basement. When lead detective Thomas Burke first stepped into the crime scene during the blizzard of '78, his boots leaving wet, gray prints on the hardwood, his administrative instincts were completely paralyzed by the utter lack of modern reference points. The technology of the late 70s could only classify the blood on the wallpaper as type O, a generic biological match for nearly 45% of the urban population, leaving investigators to rely on street snitches, neighborhood campus reports, and the highly erratic testimony of a local high school janitor who claimed to see a dark panel van sliding down the alleyway around midnight. Paranoia settled over Lincoln Park like a thick layer of toxic soot. Young women who had flocked to the neighborhood for its artistic, bohemian energy suddenly installed heavy deadbolts on doors that had historically remained unlocked since the Second World War. Families kept their daughters indoors before the amber streetlights could even flicker to life, looking at every passing stranger, every local mechanic, and every transient dock worker from the Chicago port as a potential manifestation of the butcher. Yet, despite thousands of man-hours spent checking the registries of long-haul trucking corporations and tracking down known sexual deviants across Cook County, the trail slammed into an iron wall of absolute administrative silence. As the decades bled into each other, the vanishing of Diane Vance and the mysterious disappearance of Cindy Structural Ghost mutated into a grim piece of local urban mythology, a campfire story used by senior students at the Art Institute to unnerve incoming freshmen during winter orientation. Diane's older brother, the sole surviving member of her biological family, spent his life savings on rogue private investigators, exhausting his health and his financial reserves before dying brokenhearted in a quiet suburb of Indiana, his sister's final watercolor portfolio kept wrapped in archival plastic beneath his bed. Meanwhile, right next door to the empty, cursed apartment unit which had been repeatedly remodeled and rented out to a succession of young, oblivious professional couples, a quiet, soft-spoken older man named Arthur Pendleton was becoming the very fabric of the neighborhood's eccentric charm. Arthur was a master of low-profile integration, a man who walked his elderly golden retriever every morning at dawn, tipped his hat to the local mail carriers, and spent his afternoons volunteering at the neighborhood community garden, his gentle, trembling hands planting tomatoes in the rich soil. He was a citizen above suspicion, an invisible pillar of domestic ordinariness whose quiet life was viewed as a testament to the safe, gentle evolution of the district, while his private walls, separated from the scene of the 1978 slaughter by a mere layer of lath and plaster, held the literal, mummified fragments of the truth. The operational turning point materialized with the quiet entry of a new generation of forensic intelligence analysts who didn't grow up under the systemic biases of the old Chicago Police Department, young specialists armed with computational tools that the old-school lawmen of the 70s could not have conceptually formulated. In the spring of 2026, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office launched a specialized, high-velocity cold case infiltration initiative, deploying advanced molecular archaeology to examine the physical artifacts of the city's most baffling historic homicides. A young forensic specialist named Linda Torres pulled the Vance file from its deep archival confinement, her attention immediately locking onto a specific piece of evidence that had been largely ignored during the initial investigation, an old, rusted brass bedroom door handle that had been preserved inside a brown paper evidence sack. The original field technicians had checked the metal for standard latent friction ridges using basic charcoal powders, finding nothing but a series of smudged, overlapping prints that were deemed completely unidentifiable by the primitive metrics of the late 20th century. But Torres possessed a weapon that looked past the surface of the metal, a vacuum-assisted localized cellular vacuum retrieval system capable of pulling low copy number, microscopic skin cells out of the microscopic pits and score lines of the historic brass hardware. The vacuum extraction yielded a pristine reservoir of human biological material, a microscopic cluster of dried epithelial cells that had remained trapped beneath a layer of old household wax and oxidized brass for 48 years, an environmental time capsule that had resisted structural degradation. Torres ran the sample through a high-density single-nucleotide polymorphism sequencing array, constructing a complex, high-definition genomic profile that did not generate a single hit when run through CODIS, meaning the individual had never been fingerprinted or booked for a felony in his long life. But the digital infrastructure of 2026 did something far more devastating. It uploaded the genetic profile into the massive, interconnected oceans of civilian genealogical databases, searching for long, continuous blocks of identical chromosomes that indicated a shared ancestral lineage. The computational algorithm began to tighten its digital noose with cold, mathematical certainty, tracking the lineage back to an old, insular farming family from rural southern Illinois, mapping out a direct line of male descendants that had migrated to Chicago during the industrial expansion of the mid-1970s. When the historical data strings converged on the name Arthur Pendleton, the analysts in the laboratory sat in absolute, breathless silence. They weren't looking at a transient predator or a phantom from the highway, but a man whose current registered address was the exact same Lincoln Park brownstone where Diane Vance's blood had soaked into the floors 48 years prior. The surveillance operation designed to secure a current, direct verification sample from the reclusive neighbor had to be executed with the stealth of a counterintelligence mission, as a standard search warrant served on a genealogical probability would instantly tip off his legal networks and allow him to destroy any internal domestic evidence before a laboratory could process the match. For 10 days, plainclothes state troopers disguised as municipal sanitation workers and utility technicians shadowed the elderly man as he moved through his quiet, morning routines, watching him buy his morning newspaper, purchase his organic vegetables at the local market, and feed the pigeons in the park. The moment of operational capture occurred at a small, independent coffee shop on Clark Street, a historic establishment where Arthur sat every Thursday morning to solve the crossword puzzle in the local independent paper, thinking himself entirely invisible to the world around him. He sat in a corner booth beneath a vintage neon sign, sipping his black coffee with a slow, trembling, deliberate nature before wiping his mouth with a cheap paper napkin, dropping the crumpled paper into a plastic tray, and walking out into the winter drizzle. Before the door could even finish its swinging cycle, an undercover operative had secured the discarded napkin with sterile forceps, sliding the paper into a vacuum-sealed transport tube. The laboratory sequencing took less than 24 hours. The fresh biological material harvested from the coffee shop napkin delivered an absolute 1 in a billion match against the 48-year-old epithelial cells pulled from the rusted bedroom door handle of the 1978 crime scene. The gentle, reclusive gardener of Lincoln Park was the architect of the slaughterhouse next door, a realization that made the state prosecutors move with a swift, merciless precision to secure a capital arrest warrant. The takedown was scheduled for a bright Tuesday morning, right on the front steps of the brownstone, designed to eliminate the chance of an armed barricade situation or a domestic destruction of evidence inside his apartment unit. As the black, unmarked tactical vehicles swerved onto the curb, pinning Arthur against the historic wrought iron railing of his own building, the entire street went dead silent, the birds in the old elms stopping their song as the reality of the nightmare began to unravel in the open light of day. He didn't run, he didn't scream, and his ancient hands didn't shake as the steel handcuffs clicked locked around his fragile wrists. He merely turned his head to look at the adjacent apartment window, his face wearing a cold, empty smile of complete, narcissistic satisfaction as he was guided into the rear of the state police vehicle. The news broke across the city like a massive structural rupture, dominating the evening broadcasts as the headline flashed across millions of screens. Chicago 1978 cold case solved. Victims missing roommate lived next door for 40 years. Members of the public gathered outside the Lincoln Park building in a state of collective psychological shock, staring at the small, mundane apartment windows where a killer had spent 40 years looking out at the very sidewalk where his victims' families had stood to weep for their loss. Inside the interrogation room at the Area 3 headquarters, beneath the unforgiving glare of the high-intensity fluorescent lamps, the gentle facade of the elderly gardener collapsed completely, revealing the cold, calcified structure of a clinical psychopath who had outsmarted the city's finest lawmen for half a century. Vance sat before a wall of genomic charts and forensic photographs, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly detached whisper that detailed the absolute randomness and surgical malice of that January night in 1978. He admitted that he had never intended to leave the building. He had lived in the adjacent apartment under a false name since 1976, watching the two young art students through a hidden peephole he had meticulously bored through the shared utility closet behind the water heaters. On the night of the blizzard, knowing that the roaring winds and the accumulating snow would drown out any sound of physical distress, he had stepped into their kitchen through an unlocked rear service door, holding a heavy iron tire iron he had taken from his vehicle. He struck Diane Vance down first as she turned from the record player, her blood slashing across the floral wallpaper, before turning his attention to Cindy's structural ghost, who was paralyzed with terror near the bedroom door. He didn't abduct her. He dragged her body directly through the shared wall utility access panel into his own apartment unit, where he spent the next 3 days dissecting her remains with anatomical precision under the sound of the howling storm, before burying her bones beneath the mortar of his own hearth. The legacy of the 1978 Chicago cold case is now written in the history of American criminology, not as a story of random highway violence, but as a terrifying monument to the capacity of human compartmentalization, a warning that the most horrific monsters do not live in distant, dark forests. They live behind the drywall of our own bedrooms, breathing our air, listening to our conversations, and participating in our daily routines. The Lincoln Park brownstone stands silent now, its historic brickwork casting a long, permanent shadow across a street corner that has fallen into a deep, permanent silence, its residents left to look at the walls of their own homes with a new, corrosive paranoia. The memory of Diane Vance and the recovered remains of Cindy's structural ghost have finally been pulled out of the dark basement archive and brought into the light of absolute truth, a stark reminder that no matter how deep an atrocity is buried, no matter how many decades of silence are applied to a secret, the truth remains waiting in the dark, carried on a microscopic strand of life, ready to tear down the temples of the wicked and bring the ghosts of the past home for their final, terrifying reckoning. The brickwork of Lincoln Park brownstones possesses a thick, historic density, an engineered layering of clay and mortar designed in the late 19th century to seal out the freezing, sub-zero drafts of the Illinois winter. But in the winter of 1978, that same architectural density served a far more sinister purpose. It functioned as an acoustic and structural fortress, trapping a scream within the plaster walls of Unit 2B while allowing the adjacent unit, Unit 2A, to remain completely detached, silent, and clean. To truly understand the psychological horror of the Chicago blizzard of '78, one must visualize a city completely paralyzed, buried under 29 inches of unrelenting, wind-driven snow that drifted into massive white walls across the grid of the north side. The streets were dead zones, vehicles were abandoned on the midways, and the howling gales blowing off Lake Michigan created a continuous, deafening roar that muffled the sounds of the urban landscape. It was within this environment of absolute, frozen isolation that a systematic predator turned a simple shared utility wall into a border crossing between life and a hidden grave. Diane Vance and Cynthia Cindy Structural Ghost were 19 and 20 years old, respectively, two vibrant art students who had moved to the city from small Midwestern towns to immerse themselves in the bohemian, creative energy of Lincoln Park. Their apartment was a reflection of their youth, filled with watercolor canvases, secondhand velvet armchairs, and stacks of vinyl records that provided a continuous soundtrack to their late-night painting sessions. They viewed their second-floor apartment as a sanctuary, a safe haven from the gritty, high-crime realities that plagued other sectors of the city during the late 1970s. They did not know that their sanctuary had been compromised months prior, not by a roaming street thug or an intruder from the dark alleyway below, but by the quiet, unassuming man who lived just 12 inches to the left, sharing the plaster wall that ran straight through the center of their bedrooms. Arthur Pendleton, who occupied Unit 2A under a series of meticulously forged identification papers, was a master of a highly controlled, low-frequency lifestyle. He was 32 years old in 1978, employed as an independent draft technician for a local architectural firm, a job that allowed him to spend hours studying structural blueprints, plumbing layouts, and the internal voids of historic residential buildings. He was a man of pristine, near-invisible neatness. He did not play loud music, he didn't host guests, and he always paid his rent in crisp, cash bills 3 days before it was due. The landlord viewed him as the ideal tenant, a quiet professional who anchored the floor, entirely unaware that Arthur spent his evenings inside his dark utility closet, his ear pressed against the cold lath and plaster, logging the exact daily movements, schedules, and conversations of the two young women next door. The physical mechanics of his surveillance were terrifyingly precise. Utilizing a specialized 3/8-inch diamond-tipped industrial drill bit, Arthur had bored a tiny, unnoticeable viewing channel through the rear wall of the shared utility access space, the hidden cavity that housed the building's main copper water risers and steam lines. The hole terminated exactly behind a loose knot in the pine trim of the girl's master bedroom closet, providing him with a pristine, unobstructed line of sight straight across their living space and into their sleeping quarters. He watched them live their lives in high definition through that microscopic aperture. He watched them paint, he watched them drink their morning coffee, and he watched them sleep, his mind calculating the exact parameters of their physical vulnerabilities while the snow began to accumulate on the windowsills outside. On the night of Friday, January 14th, 1978, the historic blizzard reached its catastrophic peak, dropping the temperature below zero while 50-mile-per-hour winds whipped the snow into blinding, whiteout drifts that cut off all emergency vehicle access to the Lincoln Park grid. The streetlights were buried in white, the alleyways were packed with 5-foot snowdrifts, and the acoustic roar of the storm was a relentless, low-frequency thrum that shook the glass window panes. Inside Unit 2B, Diane and Cindy had turned on their stereo to drown out the sound of the wind, the low, warm tones of a jazz record spinning on the turntable while they boiled a pot of coffee to stay warm during the power fluctuations. They were entirely isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by a historic act of nature, completely secure in their belief that no one could traverse the frozen city to do them harm. They did not hear the rear service door of the brownstone click open, nor did they hear the soft, deliberate footsteps stepping across the linoleum of their kitchen floor. Arthur Pendleton had not braved the storm outside. He had simply stepped out of his own kitchen door into the unheated, enclosed rear service stairwell that connected the two units. He carried a 24-inch heavy steel tire iron he had taken from his vehicle's emergency kit, his hands encased in tight, industrial rubber gloves that left no trace fibers on the wooden door frames. He moved with a smooth, athletic grace that defied the cold, stepping into their lit kitchen just as Diane turned away from the record player to pour the coffee. The attack was a manifestation of explosive, calculated violence that allowed for no defensive reaction or vocal alarm. Arthur closed the physical distance in a fraction of a second, the steel tire iron descending with crushing force against the rear of Diane's skull before she could even register the shadow in the doorway. She collapsed instantly into the floral wallpaper, a massive spray of arterial blood slashing across the pattern as her body slid silently down onto the hardwood floor, the two porcelain coffee cups shattering against the counter. Cindy, who was standing near the bedroom door frame, was instantly paralyzed by a state of acute, traumatic shock, her throat locking as she stared at the quiet neighbor who had suddenly materialized in her home like a demon out of the whiteout. Before she could break the paralysis to scream or run toward the front window, Arthur grabbed her by the throat, his gloved hand sealing her airways while he used his weight to pin her against the rusted brass handle of the inner bedroom door. He did not deliver a second blow with the iron. Instead, utilizing a fast-acting chemical sedative he had harvested from his university research days, he rendered her unconscious within 10 seconds, her body going completely flaccid in his grip. The entire double execution had taken less than 45 seconds, completely swallowed by the roaring cadence of the blizzard outside, leaving the record still spinning on the turntable and the coffee steam rising into the cold air of the kitchen. The logistical genius of Arthur Pendleton's pathology was realized during the next 72 hours of the storm. He did not attempt to carry the victims out of the building through the deep snowdrifts of the alleyway, which would have left a highly visible trail of blood and footprints for the police to find once the roads were cleared. Instead, utilizing his knowledge of the building's internal architecture, he removed the large wood-paneled access door inside the shared utility closet. He dragged Diane Vance's lifeless body and the unconscious Cindy directly through the internal structural void of the water lines, pulling them out through the corresponding panel inside his own utility closet and into the pristine, locked environment of Unit 2A. Once the bodies were inside his apartment, Arthur spent the remainder of the blizzard weekend executing a meticulous, near-surgical cleaning operation next door in Unit 2B. He used professional-grade chemical solvents to scrub the floors and the kitchen counters, leaving only the massive, unerasable blood smear on the master bedroom wallpaper, a deliberate piece of theatrical staging designed to convince the police that a violent, messy abduction had taken place. He then took Cindy's winter coat, her boots, and her purse, scattering them inside his own unit to make it appear as though she had packed her things or been forced out of the building by a transient intruder. When the Area 3 homicide detectives finally managed to dig their vehicles out of the snowdrifts on Monday morning to breach the apartment, they found themselves staring at an engineered mystery, a staged cold case that pointed toward a phantom panel van and a long-haul trucker, while the true butcher was sitting right on the other side of the wall, eating his breakfast and listening to the police radios through his hidden viewing hole. The original investigation, led by Detective Thomas Burke, was a textbook example of procedural frustration and technological inadequacy. In 1978, forensic science was a primitive, reactive discipline. Blood analysis was limited to basic ABO typing, DNA profiling was a distant science fiction concept, and the concept of a neighbor murdering his roommates and burying them inside his own walls without ever leaving the building was entirely foreign to the department's behavioral manuals. Burke focused his energy entirely on the outside world, interviewing local sex offenders, checking the logs of the nearby transit yards, and searching the frozen ravines of the suburbs for any sign of a shallow grave. He knocked on Arthur Pendleton's door 3 times during the initial canvass, but Arthur answered each time with a calm, soft-spoken grief, offering the detectives hot coffee, showing them his clean, orderly apartment, and expressing deep, neighborly concern for the safety of the 2 beautiful girls he had watched walk down the street every morning. He was so ordinary, so helpful, and so thoroughly integrated into the domestic fabric of the block that Burke completely eliminated him from the ledger of suspicion, filing his witness statements away into the blue cardboard folder that would remain frozen in the dark for the next 48 years. The calcification of a metropolitan lie requires a quiet, unwavering devotion to routine, an absolute submission to the mundane that can successfully blind the outside world to the rotting architecture beneath its feet. By the early 1990s, the twin vanishing of Diane Vance and Cynthia Cindy structural ghost had officially settled into the deepest sediment of the Cook County Cold Case Registry, shifting from an active, bleeding police emergency into an urban ghost story whispered by young couples who rented the historic brownstones of Lincoln Park. The building itself, a beautiful, 4-story red brick structure with arched windows and heavy wrought iron railings, had undergone 3 separate internal renovations over the decades, its wood panels replaced, its plumbing updated, and its rent skyrocketing as the old, bohemian artist colony of the late 70s dissolved into a hyper-prosperous enclave of young corporate lawyers and financial analysts. The new tenants who moved in and out of Unit 2B over those 40 long years lived in a state of pristine, blissful ignorance. They hung modern abstract prints over the spot where the floral wallpaper had once held Diane's arterial blood. They installed high-end espresso machines on the counters where the porcelain cups had shattered during the blizzard of '78, and they slept soundly in bedrooms separated from a secret sepulchre by a mere 12 inches of lath, plaster, and old horsehair insulation. The building was a monument to historical amnesia, its structural envelope holding a secret so profound that its exposure would eventually shatter the psychological sanity of the entire North Side. And right next door, separated from those oblivious professional couples by that single, fragile layer of drywall, Arthur Pendleton lived out a masterpiece of clinical compartmentalization. The decade between 1985 and 1995 was a period of immense, quiet stabilization for the killer. He had legally assumed the permanent identity of a retired architectural drafter whose small private pension and modest inheritance allowed him to exist entirely below the administrative radar of the modern state. He did not own a television, he did not utilize credit cards, and he never permitted a utility inspector or a landlord to cross the threshold of Unit 2A, claiming with a gentle, self-deprecating laugh that his acute respiratory allergies required him to maintain a pristine, highly controlled domestic environment that could not be disturbed by outside contaminants. The neighborhood grew to love him as a living fixture of their historic block, the quiet, eccentric gardener of Lincoln Park. Every morning at precisely 6:15 a.m., regardless of the brutal Chicago weather, Arthur would emerge from the heavy oak front door of the brownstone, dressed in a faded canvas chore coat and a pristine wool cap, his ancient golden retriever, Barnaby, padding slowly beside his boots. He moved with a slow, deliberate dignity, tipping his hat to the young mothers pushing designer strollers, joking with the local mail carriers about the unreliability of the transit authority, and leaving small bags of organic tomatoes from the community garden on the porches of neighbors who were suffering from seasonal colds. He was the very picture of gentle, small-town American righteousness preserved inside a high-density urban landscape, a citizen so thoroughly woven into the daily domestic scenery that his presence functioned as an absolute, invisible shield against any form of suspicion. Yet, inside the locked, soundproofed core of Unit 2A, the internal architecture of his apartment was a terrifying testament to a lifetime of calculated, systematic pathology. Arthur had completely sealed off the shared utility closet behind the water heaters, reinforcing the heavy wooden hatch with thick rubber gaskets and industrial deadbolts to ensure that no structural odor, no microscopic trace element, and no sound could ever bleed through the water-lined cavities into the adjacent apartment. The tiny, 3/8-inch viewing hole remained perfectly active, its operational tunnel kept clear of household dust by a specialized wire brush he had designed for the purpose. He spent hours every single night sitting in a high-backed leather chair in the dark of his bedroom, his eye pressed against the aperture, watching the young professional women who rented Unit 2B as they lived their lives, drank their wine, and slept in their beds, drawing a dark, godlike euphoria from his absolute physical proximity to their innocence and his absolute control over their environment. The true, chilling architecture of a secret, however, lay beneath the hearth of his living room fireplace. In 1980, under the guise of repairing a structural sag in the floorboards that he claimed was causing his kitchen counter to tilt, Arthur had pulled up the historic oak tongue-and-groove flooring directly adjacent to the shared brick chimney stack. Beneath the floorboards lay the deep, hollow joist cavities of the building's framing, a space measuring nearly 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 16 inches deep, packed with dense, alkaline mortar dust and old insulation blankets. It was here, in the dark core of the building's physical frame, that he had deposited the meticulously sectioned, skeletal remains of Cynthia's structural ghost after his 3-day anatomical dissection during the blizzard of '78. He had encased the bones in layers of heavy industrial wax cloth, sealing the perimeter with multiple coats of high-density coal tar epoxy that completely vaporized any organic decomposition gases, turning her final resting place into a permanent, odor-free, concrete-hard matrix that was entirely invisible to the outside world. Every evening during the brutal Chicago winters, Arthur would light a small, crackling fire in that very hearth, sitting in his comfortable armchair with a volume of classical history in his lap, his leather slippers resting flat against the oak boards that covered the skull of the girl the police had spent 4 decades searching for along the highway corridors of the Midwest. He drew a profound, clinical satisfaction from this arrangement. He had not merely beaten the law, he had integrated his crime into his domestic comfort, turning the physical remains of his victims into the literal structural foundation of his home. He watched the original detectives grow old, retire, and pass away in distant suburbs. He watched the Vance family lineage wither and disappear from the state records. And he watched the city council pass historical preservation ordinances that guaranteed his building could never be demolished or subjected to major invasive structural alterations without a multi-year administrative review process. He had conquered time, geography, and justice itself, creating a life of absolute security behind a wall of lath, plaster, and neighborly smiles. Meanwhile, the psychological decay of the community's memory was complete. The Area 3 homicide basement was an underworld of forgotten atrocities, a vast, silent labyrinth of rusting steel shelves and dust-covered cardboard boxes that sat directly beneath the busy feet of the modern detectives who marched through the daily gang violence of the 21st century. Box 78-0412 remained exactly where Detective Burke had deposited it before his heart failed him in 1994, its cardboard sides warped by decades of seasonal humidity, its contents holding the quiet, microscopic evidence of a neighbor's damnation. The rusted brass bedroom door handle lay in the dark, preserved within its cheap paper evidence sack, the microscopic skin cells still trapped in the scores and pits of the metal, a biological time capsule waiting for a future generation of molecular hunters who would look past the gentle, silver-haired gardener of Lincoln Park to find the monster hiding in the wall. As the millennium turned, Arthur's confidence grew into an absolute, unshakable sense of cosmic immunity. He had survived the transition into the digital age. He had outlived every human being who had ever seen his original, unforged identification papers. He had successfully buried his secrets beneath layers of concrete epoxy and historical respectability. He had become an institution on his block, a structural pillar of the neighborhood's identity, a man whose public existence was so thoroughly integrated into the daily visual fabric of Lincoln Park that his ruin would mean the collapse of the very moral assumptions that allowed the community to feel safe in their homes. He had outwitted 40 years of human intelligence, completely blind to the fact that the digital universe was constructing a new kind of net, a mathematical ocean of genetic code that could reach back through nearly half a century of silence to pull a ghost out of the drywall. The modern machinery of justice does not rely on the memory of witnesses who have long since turned to dust. It searches for the invisible, digitized sequences of life that a killer leaves behind in the deep grooves of the physical world. By the early spring of 2026, the Cook County State's Attorney's Forensic Intelligence Division had established its workspace far away from the chaotic, siren-vibrating precincts of the active city, settling into a sterile, climate-controlled laboratory facility on the upper floors of the newly constructed Layton Technology Center. This was a realm stripped of old-school police theatricality. There were no dented metal desks, no stale coffee pots, and no tobacco-stained interview rooms. Instead, the space was dominated by long rows of automated genetic sequencers, high-resolution digital mass spectrometers, and molecular biologists who treated an unsolved 1970s homicide not as a narrative mystery, but as a compressed data problem waiting for the correct technological extraction keys. At the center of this operational unit sat Dr. Linda Torres, a 34-year-old molecular archaeologist who had spent her professional career adapting high-density DNA harvesting protocols from ancient forensic archaeology to the pragmatic demands of urban cold case investigations. To Dr. Torres, the cardboard boxes gathering soot in the subterranean vaults of Area 3 homicide weren't just monuments to historical human tragedy. They were biological repositories holding the unread genetic signatures of the city's most patient predators. When her unit initiated a systematic, automated audit of Cook County's unresolved homicides from the pre-digital era, her attention was immediately locked onto Box 78-0412, the January 1978 vanishing of Diane Vance and the subsequent disappearance of Cynthia, Cindy, Vance's roommate. The folder attracted her clinical eye precisely because of the extreme, paradoxical nature of the scene description. The original field reports from 1978 detailed a high-velocity, catastrophic letting of blood inside the master bedroom, yet the physical apartment structure showed an absolute deficit of forced entry, no signs of tool marks on the window frames, and no trace of structural disturbance along the front corridors of the building. The original detectives had deduced that the victims must have been carried out into the teeth of a historic blizzard, an assumption that Torres found behaviorally and logistically flawed given the extreme physical density of the 29-inch snowdrift accumulation recorded that night. On March 11, 2026, the physical artifacts of the 1978 crime scene were pulled from their 48-year confinement and placed beneath the laminar flow hoods of the unit's main cleanroom, an isolation zone where the atmospheric air was filtered down to the microscopic particle and the technicians wore pressurized, full-body anti-contamination garments to prevent the introduction of modern civilian DNA. The primary piece of hardware that Torres targeted wasn't the stained sections of flooring, which had been compromised by decades of seasonal moisture and industrial cleaning agents during subsequent tenant occupations, but rather an item that had remained sealed inside a heavy brown paper evidence pouch since the morning of January 17, 1978, the rusted brass bedroom door handle. The original technicians of the late 70s had dusted the brass with heavy, charcoal-based powders, looking for the classic, continuous ridge patterns of a clear latent fingerprint. Finding nothing but a series of overlapping, smudged oil blurs left behind by a succession of household movements, they had noted the hardware as evidentiary zero and filed it away into the dark. But Dr. Torres did not look for fingerprints. She was searching for low copy number epithelial cells, the microscopic, dried skin flakes that are shed automatically whenever a human hand applies high-leverage physical force to a piece of metal hardware during a violent encounter. Torres did not use standard cotton swabs, which typically trap and hold delicate biological molecules within their internal cotton matrices, preventing a full laboratory extraction. She deployed a specialized, micro-staged vacuum-assisted forensic collection system known as an MVAC. The device functioned by spraying an ultra-pure, pressurized sterile solution onto the intricate pits, scratches, and oxidized scores of the historic brass handle, immediately followed by a high-velocity microvacuum nozzle that pulled the fluid and any loosened organic particles out of the metal's microscopic topography. The fluid harvested by the microvacuum was run through a high-efficiency multi-stage polyether sulfone filtration membrane, concentrating the solid residues down until a tiny, near-invisible pellet of organic matter remained trapped at the base of a microcentrifuge vial. The extraction was an operation of extreme technical peril. The skin cells left behind in January 1978 were nearly half a century old, their internal nuclear structures severely fragmented by time, household wax applications, and the chemical powders introduced by the original investigators. To read this broken biological code, Torres utilized an advanced genetic amplification technique known as whole genome sequencing, WGS, combined with an alignment algorithm designed to repair degraded historical DNA sequences. For 72 continuous hours, the capillary sequencers worked in the dark, using high-intensity laser arrays to read the microscopic chemical bonds of the captured molecules. When the final computational readout populated Torres's terminal screen, it didn't present a standard 20 loci Cody's profile, which requires intact, modern DNA to function and is entirely useless if the suspect has never committed a modern felony. It delivered a comprehensive single nucleotide polymorphism (SNP) profile, mapping over 650,000 individual data points across the absolute architecture of the suspect's genetic identity. The profile was a high-resolution digital blueprint of an individual. The phenotype markers predicted a male subject of deep Germanic and English ancestry, with a biological inclination toward an O-negative blood type, distinct facial metrics, and a highly specific regional ancestral footprint rooted in an insular agrarian population that had occupied the southern flatlands of Illinois since the mid-19th century. Torres took this digitized profile and uploaded it into the secure portals of GeneMatch and FamilyTreeDNA, the massive, public-facing genealogical databases where millions of ordinary civilians had deposited their genetic data to map out their family lineages. The computational search arrays didn't look for a criminal record. They scanned millions of ordinary civilian profiles to find matching segments of identical chromosomes that indicated a shared grandparent, a common uncle, or a distant great-aunt. Within less than 5 minutes of the digital upload, the terminal screen in the latent center lit up with a tight, high-probability cluster of genetic matches, none of them direct hits, but rather a clean, mathematical constellation of relatives located across the Midwest. The primary anchor point was a 64-year-old retired diesel mechanic living in downstate Effingham named Ronald Pendleton, who had uploaded his DNA 9 months prior to find his maternal grandfather's military heritage. The algorithm calculated that Ronald shared approximately 12.4% of his genomic configuration with the unidentified Chicago abductor, a profound biological proximity that placed him precisely in the category of a first cousin. The forensic genealogists assigned to the unit immediately launched a reverse lineage extraction, taking Ronald Pendleton's verified family tree and building it backward to the early 20th century, digging through digital birth registries, old farming census records, regional land deeds, and World War II draft cards preserved in the state archives. They traced the family line back to a single homestead in rural Union County, Illinois, a lineage that had produced 3 male children who migrated north to the industrial centers of Chicago during the manufacturing boom of the mid-1970s. Branch by branch, individual by individual, the data analysts systematically pruned the Pendleton family tree of its physical and logical impossibilities. 2 of the brothers were eliminated from the ledger of suspicion within 48 hours. One had been confined to a military staging base in West Germany during the winter of '78, while the second had suffered a catastrophic industrial injury at a steel yard in Gary, Indiana. In 1975, that left him permanently wheelchair-bound and physically incapable of executing a high-leverage physical assault. By the final week of March 2026, the mathematical parameters of the genealogical tracking algorithm had completed their contraction, bypassing the migratory branches of the family, bypassing the out-of-state relatives, and converging with absolute, terrifying precision on a single, living individual whose registered residential address sent a shockwave through the Area 3 Homicide Command Desk. The digital readout displayed a single name at the terminal end of the data pipeline: Arthur Pendleton, Unit 2A, 1422, North Orchard Street, Chicago, Illinois. The reaction within the executive ranks of the state's attorney's office was a state of immediate, cold paralysis. The chief of the cold case division sat in Dr. Torres's cleanroom viewing area, his eyes fixed on the display monitor that linked the 48-year-old DNA on the bedroom handle straight to the adjacent apartment unit of the historic Lincoln Park brownstone. They weren't looking at a transient phantom who had fled down the interstate to Texas or California. They were looking at a neighbor who had spent nearly half a century living exactly 12 inches away from the scene of the slaughter, breathing the same air, walking the same sidewalks, and watching the city change around him while his victim's blood remained dry behind the wall. If we step onto that property with a standard search warrant based on a genealogical match, a high-end defense attorney will claim we ran a lawless fishing expedition through public data boards, the chief prosecutor whispered, his pen marking the margins of the file. We cannot afford a single procedural variance. We need a fresh, direct biological sample harvested from his current body in the public world without him ever knowing we have breached his perimeter. We need to lock the loop before he realizes the past has finally found a way through the brickwork. The atmospheric conditions gripping the north side of Chicago during the first week of April 2026 were defined by a biting, transitional chill, the heavy gray dampness of a delayed spring rolling off Lake Michigan and settling into the narrow corridors of Lincoln Park. Along North Orchard Street, the historic brownstones stood like rows of quiet, brick-faced sentinels, their heavy stone steps and ornate iron railings projecting an image of unshakable urban prosperity and domestic calm. Young professionals in tailored athletic gear jogged toward the lakefront path, private delivery trucks maneuvered through the tight residential parking grids, and municipal street sweepers cleared the gutters of the winter's accumulated grime. It was a picture-perfect tableau of modern, upper-middle-class stability. But beneath this surface of quiet luxury, a silent, deep-cover tactical surveillance web was tightening around the second floor of the red brick building at number 1422. The active containment operation was commanded by Special Agent Marcus Vance, an investigator who, despite the bureaucratic irony of sharing a surname with a 1978 victim through no biological connection, handled the mission with a cold, absolute clinical focus. Marcus was a 20-year veteran of the Illinois State Police's Special Operations Command, a man whose career had been forged in the high-stakes theater of tracking sophisticated, long-term fugitives and dismantling heavily insulated white-collar criminal networks across the Midwest. He understood the delicate chemistry of the invisible stakeout, the precise science of dissolving a multi-vehicle tracking team into the routine visual background of a highly sensitive residential district. Yet, as he sat in the rear of a dark, unmarked commercial utility van parked 40 yards south of Arthur Pendleton's front door, his eyes fixed on a high-definition monitoring array, his pulse ran with a sharp, professional tension. The operational parameters dictated by the Cook County State's attorney were absolute and unyielding, total passive observation. The field units were strictly forbidden from utilizing any traditional intrusive methods that could puncture the target's highly refined psychological comfort zone. They could not tap his digital phone lines because Arthur did not possess them. They could not monitor his internet traffic because he lived entirely offline, and they could not request a standard garbage pull from the building's shared rear alley bins. As the maintenance supervisor who handled the waste disposal was a long-term acquaintance who viewed Arthur as a local saint. A single operational anomaly, a strange vehicle idling 5 minutes too long with its exhaust running, a utility worker asking specific questions about the building's internal structural modifications, would be noticed instantly by the reclusive tenant, risking a domestic barricade situation or the immediate, internal destruction of historical evidence before a laboratory could verify the match. The mission lived or died on a single, clean directive: secure a fresh, uncompromised biological signature from Arthur Pendleton's current body without his knowledge. For the first 6 days of the deployment, the surveillance logs resembled a clinical study in pristine, unassailable geriatric ordinariness. At exactly 6:15 a.m. every morning, the heavy, historic oak door of the brownstone would click open, and Arthur would step out onto the stone steps, looking like a living monument to neighborhood stability. He was 80 years old, yet he moved with a slow, calculating steadiness, his tall frame clad in a faded canvas chore coat, a pristine wool cap pulled low over his silver-rimmed spectacles. Beside him walked his ancient golden retriever, Barnaby, a dog whose slow, arthritic pace perfectly matched the old man's cadence. Arthur would stop on the sidewalk, turning his face to the cold lake breeze, taking a deep, serene breath before embarking on his standard 3-block loop around the neighborhood square. Marcus watched the target through a stabilized 800mm telephoto lens mounted inside a false utility hatch on the side of the van, analyzing every physical gesture with behavioral intensity. Arthur was a master of low-frequency social integration. He tipped his hat to the young mothers walking their infants. He smiled warmly at the local mail carriers, occasionally handing them small bags of birdseed or home-matured compost for their window boxes. And he spent 45 minutes every afternoon volunteering at the North Orchard Community Garden, his gentle, vein-streaked hands carefully turning the dark soil to prepare the beds for early spring tomatoes. There was no somatic manifestation of a guilty conscience, no erratic scanning of his perimeter, no physical anomalies that suggested a man who slept with the skeletal remains of a 19-year-old girl tucked inside the joist cavities beneath his armchair. He looked like the gentle soul of the block, an old-school neighbor whose survival was a comfort to the modern, fast-paced professionals surrounding him. The true logistical nightmare for the surveillance team lay in Arthur's hypervigilant domestic hygiene routine, a pattern of behavior that Dr. Torres back in the Leighton Center began to categorize not as an elderly eccentricity, but as a deeply calcified forensic countermeasure developed over a half-century of secret survival. Arthur lived an entirely self-contained physical existence. He did not eat at local diners. He purchased raw, basic ingredients, flour, potatoes, root vegetables, from a small, traditional Polish grocery 3 blocks away, carrying them home in a reusable canvas sack that he personally laundered every weekend. When he drank from a public water fountain in the park after walking his dog, he didn't touch his lips to the metal nozzle. He utilized a small, portable aluminum cup that he immediately wiped clean with a sterile cloth and returned to his deep pocket. He didn't use public trash receptacles, and he never permitted a piece of paper, a discarded tissue, or a strand of wool from his garments to fall from his person onto the public sidewalk. He was a biological ghost walking through a high-definition world, leaving no trace of his current genetic identity for the hunters who circled his block. The critical fracture in this defensive routine occurred on Thursday, April 9th, a day defined by a sudden, brutal shift in the local weather patterns as a fast-moving, sub-zero low-pressure system from Canada collided with the humid air of the Illinois River Basin, triggering a violent squall of freezing sleet and heavy, opaque winter fog that blanketed Lincoln Park in a cold, gray shroud. At 10:15 a.m., despite the hazardous weather that had driven the rest of the neighborhood's elderly residents indoors, Arthur emerged from the brownstone alone, his dog left behind inside the warmth of Unit 2A. He moved with a quicker, more purposeful stride, his canvas coat zipped to the throat as he headed toward Clark Street, a major commercial artery that sat on the western edge of his operational perimeter. The surveillance team transitioned into a walking, multi-agent tracking formation, their operatives dressed in ordinary civilian winter clothing, heavy parkas, hooded sweatshirts, and running shoes, keeping the target within line of sight while rotating positions at every intersection to avoid catching his attention. Arthur turned into the entrance of a small, independent coffee shop called the Century Lounge, a historic, wood-paneled establishment that had survived the gentrification of the district, its interior defined by low acoustic ceilings, high-backed vinyl booths, and a vintage neon clock that threw a warm, amber glow over the Formica tables. It was a space where the old-school residents of the North Side gathered to escape the damp chill of the lake weather. Marcus Vance and Detective Maria Ramirez moved with immediate, synchronized velocity, stepping through the heavy glass door of the coffee shop less than 30 seconds after the target had entered, the small brass bells above the frame chiming softly over the murmur of the interior conversation. The air inside smelled of burnt espresso, stale chicory, and the damp wool of coats drying near the radiators. Arthur had taken a position in the furthest, most isolated booth at the rear of the room, sitting directly beneath a framed black-and-white photograph of the 1933 World's Fair, his back turned to the main counter, his spectacles resting on the table as he pulled a folded section of the morning newspaper from his jacket pocket to solve the crossword puzzle. Marcus and Ramirez took a table in the adjacent center section, their angles carefully selected to ensure that while they appeared to be two ordinary office workers discussing a real estate contract, their peripheral sightlines had a clear, unobstructed view of the old man's hands. Arthur ordered a single cup of black chicory coffee from an elderly waitress who had known him for 20 years, speaking to her in a low, gentle murmur that possessed a natural, comforting warmth. When the white porcelain mug arrived, he did not use his private aluminum cup. In this old, familiar sanctuary where he had sat every Thursday morning since 1982, He allowed his defensive guard to slip for a brief, human interval, trusting that the anonymity of his 4-decade routine would continue to shield him from the world. He held the mug with both hands, his long, trembling fingers wrapping around the warm porcelain, his mouth touching the rim as he took slow, measured sips while his pen traced letters into the grid of the newspaper puzzle. He sat there for 20 agonizing minutes, an ancient slaughterhouse architect solving puzzles in a warm room, completely blind to the fact that 5 feet away, a state tactical operative was analyzing the exact surface of his lips through a pocket-sized digital magnification lens hidden inside a leather folio. Marcus watched the white porcelain rim, his heart rate accelerating against his ribs. This was the absolute nexus of the 48-year investigation. Every computer algorithm, every family tree, every man-hour spent digging through the soot of the Area 3 archives, it all converged on the biological residue currently accumulating on the edge of that cheap ceramic mug. At 10:45 a.m., Arthur completed the puzzle, folded the newspaper neatly into his pocket, and left a crisp $2 bill on the Formica table to cover the tab. He stood up, pulled his wool cap back over his silver hair, and walked slowly toward the front exit, his face wearing that same serene, benevolent smile as he nodded goodbye to the waitress and stepped back out into the freezing winter drizzle. Marcus didn't wait for the front door bells to finish their chime. He slid out of his chair, his right hand already encased in a thin, sterile nitrile glove that he had pulled from his inner pocket beneath the table. He crossed the wood-paneled room with a smooth, unhurried stride, slipping into the rear booth before the waitress could emerge from the kitchen with her clearing tray. Under the shadow of the high-backed vinyl booth and the low light of the corner, he picked up the white porcelain mug by the lower structural base, completely avoiding the rim where Arthur's fresh saliva had soaked into the glaze. Using a specialized, vacuum-sealed biological transport tube designed for rapid field collection, he lowered the mug into the container, twisting the heavy polymer cap until it locked with a sharp, airtight click that broke the low hum of the coffee shop's ventilation system. He looked down through the clear plastic walls of the tube at the wet, translucent circle on the porcelain rim, a pristine, high molecular weight reservoir of genetic data that would dissolve 48 years of Lincoln Park deception within 24 hours. He slid the tube into his canvas coat, locked eyes with Ramirez, and gave a single, imperceptible nod. The invisible watch on Orchard Street was officially over. The molecular execution was about to begin. The mechanical deconstruction of a 48-year-old illusion of innocence required exactly 38 seconds of physical execution. Friday, April 10th, 2026, broke over Lincoln Park with a stark, slate-gray sharpness, the heavy coastal fog from Lake Michigan clinging to the upper cornices of the historic brownstones like a cold, damp shroud. At 8 a.m., North Orchard Street was moving at the predictable, hyper-regulated pace of a prosperous urban neighborhood. High-end delivery vans taxied corporate packages to manicured stoops. Young professionals in designer activewear jogged past the iron railings toward the lakefront path, and in the communal spaces of the corner park, early morning commuters sipped their espressos while reading financial analytics on their screens. It was a domestic kingdom of absolute order, completely insulated from the jagged historical violence of the late 20th century by millions of dollars of real estate and a collective, multi-generational amnesia. At exactly 8:11 a.m., 3 unmarked white utility vans, entirely devoid of municipal lettering or police insignias, glided into the curbside parking slots directly flanking the entrance of number 1422. They did not trigger sirens, they did not flash roof-mounted emergency arrays, and they did not deploy the high-visibility tactical hardware that typically signals a major felony intervention. Instead, 8 operators dressed in ordinary civilian work clothes, faded canvas jackets, heavy denim jeans, and leather utility boots, stepped smoothly out of the side doors, their hands tucked casually into their pockets as they dispersed into a wide, strategic perimeter across the concrete sidewalk. To the young professional couples looking down from their third-story arched windows, they appeared to be nothing more than a standard fiber-optic maintenance crew arriving to service the subterranean data trunk lines. But beneath those loose-fitting canvas jackets, the heavy ceramic plates of body armor sat tight against their ribs, and their fingers were resting inches from the grips of their concealed automatic service weapons. Special Agent Marcus Vance led the line, his pace measured, silent, and completely unhurried, his eyes locked onto the far corner of the square where North Orchard Street intersected with the main commercial line of Clark Street. He carried the folded, heavy parchment of the Cook County capital murder arrest warrant inside his left breast pocket, right against the structural steel plate of his tactical vest, feeling the paper shift with every breath. He had spent the preceding 24 hours mentally cataloging the behavioral boundaries of the man he was about to intercept. He knew that Arthur Pendleton would not interpret this deployment as a standard law enforcement action, but as an impossible, surreal rupture in the private reality he had curated for half a century. The core objective was to establish absolute physical containment before the elderly suspect could realize that the microscopic signatures of his 1978 slaughterhouse had finally been pulled out of the dark. At precisely 8:14 a.m., the tall, slightly stooped silhouette of Arthur Pendleton materialized through the Gray River fog at the eastern edge of the block. He looked exactly like the living icon of neighborhood stability that the community had broken bread with for 48 years. He was 80 years old, yet he moved with a calculating, rhythmic steadiness, his long frame clad in his signature faded canvas chore coat, his silver-rimmed spectacles resting square beneath the brim of a pristine wool cap. Beside his heavy work boots, his ancient golden retriever, Barnaby, padded slowly across the concrete, the dog's arthritic limp perfectly synchronizing with the old man's deliberate, unhurried stride. In his right hand, Arthur carried a small paper bag containing 2 fresh Kaiser rolls he had purchased from the Polish bakery, routine domestic transaction that marked the completion of his daily loop around the square. He stopped for a brief second to tip his hat to a passing mail carrier, his face wearing that familiar, serene, benevolent smile that had acted as his supreme camouflage since the final snows of '78. Arthur. Marcus Vance's voice broke the quiet bass line of the street's morning murmur like a heavy sheet of iron falling onto granite, not a shout, but a cold, administrative command that caused the mail carrier to freeze instantly on the sidewalk. Pendleton stopped exactly 2 steps from the base of his own red brick stairs, his head turning with a slow, mechanical deliberation toward the source of the sound. His eyes, clear and unnaturally bright behind his spectacles, scanned the group of plainclothes operators as they closed their tactical semicircle around his position, effectively sealing off his approach to the brownstones' front door and cutting off any line of retreat toward the open alleyway behind the garden fence. The gentle smile did not immediately vanish from the old man's face. It merely froze, morphing into an expression of polite, slightly deaf, geriatric confusion, the look of an innocent grandfather being interrupted by a group of rude utility workers. "Good morning, young men." Arthur's voice was remarkably smooth, a gentle, soothing murmur that carried the authentic, historic accent of the Old North Side. "If you are here to dig up the water main behind the utility closet, you should speak with the building supervisor first. Barnaby and I have just finished our morning walk, and I'm afraid my joints don't tolerate the damp air for very long." He made a sudden, purposeful movement to step past them, his heavy leather boot touching the first red brick stair, but Special Agent Marcus Vance stepped directly into his path, climbing onto the second step until he was standing just 12 inches above the suspect, looking straight down into the cold, ancient eyes of the gardener. Marcus reached into his canvas jacket, pulled out the gold and blue enamel shield of the Illinois State Police Special Operations Command, and held it rock steady in the gray morning light. "Arthur Pendleton, I am Special Agent Marcus Vance," the detective stated, his voice dropping into a low, deadly serious frequency that caused the old man's fingers to lock instantly around the paper bakery bag. "I have a warrant issued by the Circuit Court of Cook County for your immediate arrest on 2 counts of first-degree murder, specifically for the January 14th, 1978, abductions and homicides of Diane Vance and Cynthia and Sterling. The delivery of those names that had been buried beneath layers of plaster, remodeling trim, and historical amnesia for 48 years, dropped into the silent street with the crushing force of a structural collapse. The mail carrier dropped his canvas bag, a dozen envelopes scattering across the wet concrete like dead leaves. A young professional woman who had just stepped onto her porch to check the weather froze mid-stride, her keys slipping from her hand and clattering loudly against the iron stairs. The uncompromised resurrection of the 1978 victims on the very steps of the Orchard Street building broke the illusion of the neighborhood's safety with a violent, shattering finality. The physical transformation that occurred in Arthur Pendleton's face during those 3 seconds of legal articulation was a sight that Marcus Vance would later describe in his official report as an encounter with a different psychological species. The gentle, soft-spoken elder of Lincoln Park vanished instantly, the delicate muscles around his mouth and jaw hardening into a rigid, venomous grimace of absolute, psychopathic contempt. His eyes did not widen with the panic of an old man caught in a net. Instead, his pupils contracted into tiny black pins behind his lenses, his gaze shifting from a polite neighbor to an apex predator analyzing the structural integrity of an enclosure. His jaw locked with a violent, visible muscular spasm that caused the thick blue veins along his throat to pulse dark against his collar line. "This is an absurd, lawless piece of street harassment," Pendleton whispered, his voice losing its warm, gentle register, replaced by a low, vibrating hiss that was captured with absolute clarity by the tactical audio arrays hidden beneath Marcus's lapel. "This is a disgusting, politically motivated frame job designed to terrorize an old man and extort this district. I have lived on this block since before you were born, young man. I have tended the very soil you are standing on. You have no authority to touch me on these stones." He made a sudden, surprisingly explosive movement to push past Marcus, his heavy shoulder driving forward to force his way toward the heavy oak front door, but Detective Ramirez and a second tactical operator moved with the synchronized precision of trained hounds. They lunged across the steps, catching the old man by his canvas sleeves and driving his body flat against the historic wrought iron railing of the brownstone before his hands could reach the interior pockets of his chore coat. The paper bakery bag burst open against the metal, the 2 fresh Kaiser rolls rolling into the dirty street slush alongside the discarded mail. "Get your hands off me, you street filth," Arthur roared, his voice cracking into a raw, guttural, screeching register that sounded completely divorced from the peaceful gardener the neighborhood had loved for decades. "Do you know who I am? I will have your supervisors ruined. I will see your names dragged through the dirt of every city council chamber in this state." He began to thrash against the restraint of the operators with a terrifying, muscular strength that defied his 80 years, his canvas coat tearing at the shoulder seams as he used his long arms and heavy boots to fight the zip ties, his face turning a dark, dangerous purple as the pristine veneer of the saint was ripped away to reveal the raw, jagged architecture of his true pathology. For 30 chaotic seconds, the premier icon of Orchard Street was nothing more than a violent, desperate suspect wrestling with state police in the open air, his silver hair falling across his eyes, his breath coming in hot, ragged gasps against the iron bars. "Stop fighting, Arthur," Marcus Vance shouted over the rising window shouts of the gathering neighbors, his hand clamping around the suspect's right wrist with a bone-crushing leverage that forced the limb behind his back until the first loop of the high-tensile steel restraints clicked locked into the bone. "It's over. The DNA harvested from your coffee mug on Clark Street matches the epithelial cells pulled from the bedroom door handle of Unit 2B. The science has caught up to you. Your own biology has broken the wall." The moment the word DNA collided with his consciousness, Arthur Pendleton's entire physical structure went completely flaccid, the kinetic resistance draining out of his muscles instantly as if a primary breaker switch had been thrown in his central nervous system. He stopped roaring. He stopped twisting, his forehead resting flat against the cold, wet iron of his own residential monument, his eyes fixed on the Kaiser rolls that were currently absorbing the black slush of the gutter. The scientific mention of the genomic match was the ultimate verbal silver bullet. It stripped away his ability to claim an administrative oversight. It rendered his historical camouflage useless before it could even enter a precinct, and it forced him to realize that the biological ghost he thought he had buried behind his hearth 48 years ago had finally returned to drag him down into the dirt. Ramirez pulled the old man's left wrist back, securing the second cuff with a sharp, heavy click that signaled the absolute termination of his half-century reign of silence. The patrician butcher of Lincoln Park was in chains. As they turned him around to guide him down the red brick steps toward the open rear doors of the lead utility van, his ancient golden retriever, Barnaby, sat quietly on the concrete, his tail thumping once against the stone, completely oblivious to the fact that his gentle master was being led away like a common monster. Hundreds of corporate professionals and university students had rushed to the windows of the surrounding brownstones, staring down at the scene in a state of collective, catatonic disbelief. The man who had been the very symbol of their neighborhood's moral and historic sanity was being shoved into the cage of a state transport vehicle, his head bowed, his hands bound behind his back, his canvas coat stained with the grime of his own steps, while the digital networks of the state flashed the unalterable headline to every corner of the globe: Chicago 1978 cold case solved, victims missing. Roommate lived next door for 40 years. The mechanical transition from the gray, fog-shrouded sidewalk of North Orchard Street to the windowless, soundproofed isolation of Interview Room 4 at the Cook County High Security Facility required exactly 14 minutes of high-velocity transit. Within this subterranean concrete block vault, the carefully manicured domestic reality of Lincoln Park ceased to exist. There were no historic wrought iron railings, no blooming community gardens, and no familiar neighborhood landmarks to ground the psychological illusions of the suspect. The space was an austere, gray-painted cube containing a single reinforced steel table bolted directly into the concrete floor, 3 high-impact plastic chairs, and a massive, one-way mirrors pan that dominated the western wall, behind which a silent team of behavioral analysts, state prosecutors, and the district commander sat with their eyes fixed entirely on the old man who had outsmarted the city's finest lawmen for 48 years. Arthur Pendleton sat in the central chair, his hands handcuffed behind his back, his faded canvas chore coat removed to reveal the cheap, fraying flannel shirt he wore underneath. The silver hair that had looked so charmingly eccentric beneath his wool cap on the sidewalk was now matted and chaotic, clinging to his temples in thin, wet streaks that exposed the sharp, predatory contours of his skull. For the first 2 hours of his confinement, he had maintained a rigid, unblinking silence, his eyes fixed on the blank concrete wall directly ahead of him, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic, highly calculated cadence that simulated the meditative breathing of a Zen practitioner but felt to the watching profilers like a continuous, desperate rehearsal of a legal defense script. Special Agent Marcus Vance entered the room at precisely 10:45 a.m., carrying a single, heavy blue cardboard accordion file that held the complete, 4-decade physical and digital legacy of Box 78-0412. He did not drop the file onto the table with an aggressive, theatrical slam. He placed it down with a slow, deliberate neatness, pulling out his chair and sitting directly opposite the 80-year-old gardener with his gloved hands flat against the cold steel surface. He did not activate a portable recording device, as the 3 studio-grade omnidirectional microphones embedded in the ceiling tiles were already streaming the high-definition audio feed directly to an encrypted state server in Austin. "Arthur," Marcus began, his voice flat, conversational, and completely stripped of the polite, geriatric titles that the suspect had used as social currency for half a century. "The local news networks have already cleared their programming blocks to run the footage of your transport. The property management company has filed an emergency eviction and structural liability suit against your unit shell, and your corporate public defenders are currently in a closed-door briefing trying to figure out how to handle a 48-year-old forensic fingerprint match. The garden is gone. It's just you, me, and the steel." Pendleton did not immediately shift his gaze from the wall, his thin jaw tightening until the heavy muscles at the base of his jaw pulsed beneath his wrinkled skin. When he finally turned his head to look at Marcus, his clear, bright eyes were completely devoid of the soft, benevolent warmth he usually wore like a shield, replaced instead by a cold, calculating, razor-sharp intensity that looked for an absolute psychological vulnerability in the detective's composure. "You speak of gardens and steel, Agent Vance, because your narrow intellect is entirely confined by the rudimentary manuals of municipal law enforcement," Pendleton said, his voice remarkably smooth and steady despite the hours of isolation, filling the concrete cube with its natural, low-frequency hum. You think you have captured a criminal. You do not possess the historical perspective to realize that you are merely disrupting a perfectly stabilized architectural equation. This warrant is a performance of bureaucratic desperation, a collection of unverified trace theories and contaminated database probabilities designed to satisfy a public relations deadline. Marcus did not blink. He reached into the blue folder, pulling out a series of high-contrast, glossy forensic photographs from 1978 and laying them out across the steel table like a sequence of tarot cards. The first image was a stark, black-and-white flash snapshot of Unit 2B's master bedroom door handle, the polished brass smudged with charcoal dust and marred by deep mechanical score lines. The second was a high-resolution macro photograph of the single nucleotide polymorphism mapping array generated by Dr. Torres, highlighting the distinct chromosomal columns that had been extracted from the metal hardware. "Let's look at the equation, Arthur," Marcus said, his finger resting flat against the edge of the genomic readout. "This isn't a public relations deadline. This is an absolute biological match. This is your skin, left deep inside the microscopic grooves of that bedroom door handle when you pinned Cynthia Sterling against the frame after you crushed Diane Vance's skull with a tire iron during the blizzard of '78. You didn't do it because you were a desperate drifter, and you didn't do it because they knew a secret. You did it because you wanted to see if you could turn the physical structure of your own residential building into an untraceable tomb while the city was screaming outside your window." Pendleton's eyes dropped to the photographs for a fraction of a second, his pupils dilating as his brain processed the physical reality of the evidence he had spent 48 years believing was safely encased beneath 3 layers of coal tar epoxy and historic oak flooring. A subtle, near-invisible shift occurred in his posture. His shoulders dropped back slightly, his chest expanding as he took a deep, steadying breath, his face settling into a mask of serene, stoic detachment that behavioral profilers categorize as the absolute defense barrier of a malignant narcissist. "I have offered hot coffee to the original detectives who walked through that apartment in '78, young man," Pendleton murmured, his tone softening into that gentle, neighborly cadence he usually reserved for his community garden volunteer sessions. "I sat with Detective Burke while his feet were frozen from the snow drifts. I spent 40 years helping this street feel like a safe, gentle home for the young people who moved here from the country. If you think that a generic civilian database lead can wipe away a lifetime of unassailable local residency and domestic devotion, you are failing the basic tenets of logic. I am the history of that block. I am not a monster." "We are completely past the history performance, Arthur," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the gentle delivery with a cold, administrative finality. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the folder, the genomic verifier report generated 24 hours prior by Dr. Torres in the Leighton Center. "This isn't a circumstantial database lead anymore. This is a direct identity match. We tracked you to the Century Lounge last Thursday. We watched you order a black coffee, and we watched you solve the crossword puzzle. We harvested that porcelain mug out of the booth the second your boots cleared the entryway." Marcus slid the high-density SNP verification grid across the steel table, his pen pointing to the 24 international loci markers that were aligned in 2 perfectly identical columns. "The DNA extracted from your fresh saliva on that porcelain rim matches the DNA extracted from the dried skin cells pulled from the 1978 door handle with a statistical certainty of 1 in 84 quadrillion," Marcus stated, the numbers falling into the small concrete room like heavy pieces of iron. "That means there is no room for an expert to talk about contamination, there is no room to blame a phantom panel van in the alley, and there is no room to play the deaf old man. Your own mouth signed the ledger of your ruin." The silence that followed this statement was absolute, a suffocating, pressurized vacuum that lasted for nearly 2 minutes. The gentle, soft-spoken elder of Orchard Street, the icon of small-town domestic righteousness preserved inside the high-density city, didn't just crack. He vanished completely, evaporating beneath the heat of the mathematical certainty laid out on the table before him. Pendleton stared at the genomic columns, his mouth opening slightly as his breathing became rapid, shallow, and irregular, his nostrils flaring as the deep survival instincts of an unmasked predator began to misfire inside his brain. Behind the one-way mirror, the behavioral analysts leaned forward, watching the physical dissolution of an idol. Pendleton's had dropped slightly, his silver hair falling forward to cover his eyes as a low, trembling vibration began at the base of his neck and moved through his shoulders. For a moment, it looked as if he were about to break into a performance of profound, historic repentance that could be used by his legal team to angle for a plea bargain or a specialized life assignment in a medical wing. But when he finally raised his face back up to look at Marcus, there were no tears in his bright eyes. Instead, his mouth twisted into a slow, terrifying smile, a cynical, arrogant expression of pure, unadulterated vanity that had nothing to do with the neighborhood, the garden, or the dog, and everything to do with the dark, hidden thrill of a secret that had finally outgrown its cage. The voice that came out of his throat wasn't the warm, gentle murmur of his public life. It was a dry, gravelly, monotone whisper that chilled the recording technicians in the sound booth to the bone. 1 in 84 quadrillion, Pendleton muttered, his long fingers twitching slightly within the steel loops of the handcuffs behind his back. You think you have defeated me with a calculation, Agent Vance. You think you have resolved a mystery. You don't possess the architectural vision to understand that the calculation doesn't alter what I constructed. It doesn't change the fact that for 48 years, every family, every tenant, and every landlord who walked through that brownstone lived under the umbrella of my permission. I didn't just escape your police. I used your police as the background music for my domestic comfort. He leaned forward across the steel table, his face just inches from Marcus's, the scent of the stale chicory coffee and old canvas still clinging faintly to his collar. I didn't choose them because they were art students, Agent, Pendleton whispered, his eyes widening with a cold, manic intensity that revealed the true, terrifying layout of his psychosis. They were simply too beautiful, vibrant shapes moving through the shared wall of my closet. I had spent months listening to them paint, listening to their music, studying the exact layout of their pipes and their doors until I knew the blind spots of their lives better than they did. I had spent my whole youth being the quiet draft technician, the invisible assistant, the perfect tenant, while everyone around me was weak, sloppy, and chaotic. I wanted to see if I could step out of the background, execute an act of absolute, sovereign destruction, and step back into my routine without a single soul ever seeing the shadow on my hands. He paused, a short, dry chuckle rattling in his throat as his eyes scanned the photographs of the rusted door handle with a chilling, nostalgic fondness. And it was flawless, he continued, his whisper growing sharper, more intense. I struck Diane down, I paralyzed Cindy against that very brass handle, and then I dragged them through the utility void into my own kitchen while the blizzard was screaming outside. For 3 days, while the city was buried in white, I took them apart with anatomical precision, mapping their bones into the joist cavities beneath my hearth. The next morning, I stood on the steps and offered hot tea to the search parties. The more the city grieved for those missing girls, the friendlier I became, and the more the neighborhood loved me for my stability. I used their tragedy as the foundation for my respectability. Every morning I ever tipped my hat to a mother on that sidewalk was a masterpiece of absolute truth, because I knew exactly what the butcher looked like. He was the one carrying their grocery bags, watching them live, while his own living room floor was resting right on top of their daughters' skulls. Special Agent Marcus Vance sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment, though his fingers were pressed so tightly against the steel table his knuckles had turned entirely white. He had secured the confession. The studio microphones had captured every single syllable of the gardener's self-indictment, a pristine, uncoerced recording that would ensure his permanent removal from the human ledger under the highest felony statutes of the state. There would be no high-priced legal loopholes, no technical delays based on circumstantial data, and no generational appeals. The idol of Orchard Street had spoken his own damnation into the record, providing the final, absolute verification that his entire life of neighborhood devotion had been nothing more than a lethal illusion curated by an apex predator. As Marcus stood up to leave the room, closing the blue cardboard folder with a sharp, definitive snap, Arthur Pendleton remained leaning forward across the steel table, his terrifying smile frozen under the glare of the fluorescent tubes, his eyes still fixed on the glossy photograph of the rusted brass handle. He had lost his freedom, he had lost his garden, and he had lost his block, but in his corrupted, narcissistic mind, he had won the absolute victory over time itself. He had proven that a man could live as a monster in the historic heart of paradise for nearly half a century, using the very skin of the building to hide the blood on his hands, leaving an entire city to sit forever amidst the smoking, ruined remains of a domestic faith that had been weaponized against them from the very beginning. The physical exhumation of a 48-year-old crime scene buried inside the structural matrix of an active, high-density residential brownstone requires a meticulous level of precision that goes far beyond traditional archaeological digging. When an offender operates with the clinical, spatial awareness of an architectural draft technician, his hiding places are not separate geographic destinations. They are woven directly into the load-bearing joists, the utility risers, and the masonry dead zones of the building itself. On Saturday, April 11, 2026, less than 24 hours after Arthur Pendleton's physical containment on the sidewalk of North Orchard Street, a specialized multi-agency structural extraction task force initiated a complete physical takeover of the red brick brownstone at number 1422. The operation was conducted under a strict, court-mandated emergency exclusion order that bypassed the local municipal historic preservation boards and the High-End Residential Neighborhood Association. State troopers established a 2-block tactical perimeter, diverting civilian transit lines away from the Orchard Street grid and wrapping the lower exterior facade of the building in opaque, heavy-duty black weather screens. The young professional tenants who occupied the surrounding units were evacuated under a mandatory municipal structural hazard decree, forced to pack their overnight bags and watch from across the square as heavy, unmarked commercial panel trucks rolled in portable power generators, concrete coring arrays, ground-penetrating radar grids, and digital atmospheric mass spectrometers. The community was entering a state of absolute psychological shock. They were about to witness the systematic disassembly of a building that had stood as the visual anchor of their block since the late 19th century. Special Agent Marcus Vance entered the second-floor corridor of the building at 8:30 a.m., flanked by Dr. Linda Torres and a team of 4 structural engineers from the Illinois Department of Urban Infrastructure. The interior hallway smelled of expensive fresh paint, high-end wood polish from the recent luxury renovations, and the underlying, dry chemical scent of the specialized polymer sealants the task force's technical teams utilized to control trace particulate escape. They stepped across the threshold of Unit 2A, Arthur Pendleton's pristine, locked sanctuary, moving directly past his simple, utilitarian kitchen and into the living room, a space dominated by a massive, historic red brick fireplace stack that formed the central architectural spine of the entire building. The alphanumeric code deciphered from his journals doesn't describe an external burial path, Dr. Torres said, her voice sounding crisp and hollow within the empty room as she adjusted the settings on her forensic light source. He spent his entire career mapping the physical blind spots of these old North Side structures. A narcissist with his level of spatial obsession wouldn't entrust his trophies to a forest or a river where a construction crew could find them. He needed them right here, beneath his boots, inside the very framing that separated his life from the lives of the people who were replacing his victims. The engineers began their technical mapping using a high-density, 3-dimensional ground-penetrating radar unit, rolling the digital scanner array systematically across the historic oak tongue-in groove flooring directly adjacent to the brick chimney hearth. For 2 hours, the computing terminal generated a continuous, high-definition cross-sectional blueprint of the subfloor topography, mapping the parallel lines of the heavy pine floor joists that ran from the front facade to the rear service alley. The initial layers displayed nothing but standard historic construction metrics, old hand-forged iron nails, framing shims, and the uniform density of the building's central support timbers. But as the radar sensor crossed a specific 3-foot perimeter on the eastern side of the hearth, the digital interface registered a sharp, geometrically perfect structural anomaly, a series of dense, opaque masses packed tightly into the hollow cavities between joists 14, 15, and 16. The entry to this subterranean vault was a masterpiece of clandestine carpentry. Arthur had not simply sawn through the flooring, an amateur error that would have left highly visible seam lines for a landlord or an insurance inspector to detect during routine maintenance reviews. He had utilized his knowledge of historical wood joinery to build a completely invisible, mechanically decoupled access hatch. He had removed the tongue edges from 5 parallel planks of the old oak flooring, replacing the standard nails with specialized, deep-set black oxide screws whose heads were completely concealed beneath perfectly matched, hand-carved wooden plugs that simulated the natural grain and knots of the vintage timber. To release the segment, a technician had to locate 2 specific grain variations on the 3rd board, insert a high-leverage magnetic key to disengage a set of hidden internal steel latches buried 4 inches deep within the lath, and apply a steady, downward pressure of precisely 20 pounds to the adjacent hearth brick. The lead engineer executed the mechanical sequence, and with a low, dry scrape of ancient wood shifting against plaster, the 36-inch section of oak flooring lifted free from the joists, releasing an immediate, concentrated pocket of cold air into the living room. The air did not smell of active organic rot or human decomposition, a testament to the terrifying efficacy of Pendleton's forensic containment strategy, but carried a heavy, ancient density of pulverized lime, old coal tar epoxy, and the sweet, chemically artificial scent of high-grade industrial wax blankets. The technicians knelt around the exposed joist cavity, their high-intensity forensic headlamps illuminating the dark, narrow void between the framing timbers. Resting 4 inches beneath the subfloor deck, packed tightly into a bed of white, alkaline mortar dust designed to neutralize any chemical variance and absorb ambient moisture, lay a series of 4 long, heavy packages wrapped in thick canvas layers and completely encased in a hard, glassy shell of multi-layered coal tar resin. The packages were numbered sequentially from 1 to 4 using a vintage 1970s mechanical label maker, their dimensions corresponding perfectly to the anatomical segments of a human skeleton that had been broken down with the cold, detached precision of a slaughterhouse butcher. He didn't just hide her, Marcus Vance whispered, his face turning an ashen, pale gray beneath his baseball cap as he leaned over the opening, his fingers tracing the plastic labels inside the dust. He cataloged her like a blueprint. He spent 48 years sitting in that armchair, warming his feet by the fire, knowing that the bones of the girl Detective Burke was hunting across the state line were packed right into the structural joists of his living room floor. Dr. Torres supervised the extraction using a specialized hydraulic hoist system, lifting the heavy resin-coated packages out of the floor and placing them onto a sterile white drape in the center of the cleanroom workspace. When the forensic pathologists carefully chipped away the outer layers of the coal tar shield with fine surgical instruments, the interior velvet linings revealed the complete, mummified skeletal remains of Cynthia, Cindy, and Sterling, her bones arranged with a terrifying, geometric neatness that mirrored the technical diagrams found in Pendleton's drafting portfolios. Her jaw was held in place by a thin strand of stainless steel wire, her hands folded neatly over her rib cage, her small silver college ring still resting loose against the bone of her left ring finger. But the exhumation of Unit 2A did not stop at the recovery of the 1978 remains. As the task force expanded their structural search, utilizing thermal imaging cameras and acoustic wall scanners to dismantle the false utility closet that backed onto the shared wall of Unit 2B, they discovered a secondary, hidden repository built into the deep framing behind the building's main water risers. Hidden within a reinforced titanium security safe bolted directly into the brickwork of the central chimney stack lay the ultimate physical archive of Pendleton's secret lifetime, a collection of 32 small, clear glass specimen vials, each holding a single, meticulously preserved personal item harvested from his victims before their disposal. The first drawer of the safe held the small, tarnished silver watercolor charm that had been clipped from Diane Vance's key ring on the night of the blizzard. But behind that initial trophy lay a systematic, chronological timeline of horror that expanded the scope of Arthur Pendleton's pathology far beyond the borders of Cook County. The safe contained items representing 24 other young women who had vanished from university towns, transit hubs, and art communities across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin between 1972 and 2005, a vintage gold locket from a student who disappeared from a bus terminal in Champaign in 1974, a small plastic hair slide from a girl who vanished from a county fair near Peoria in 1983, a distinct enamel earring from an art student who disappeared from a gallery night in Milwaukee in 1996. Arthur had not been a disorganized local offender who struck out of sudden, emotional panic. He was a highly organized, regional apex predator who had spent his entire adulthood utilizing his professional access to the city's architectural planning data to map, hunt, and systematically process his victims within the silent, unmonitored core of his own residential property. Every time he stepped out onto the sidewalk, tipping his hat to the young professional mothers of Orchard Street and handing them bags of home-matured compost from his community garden plots, he was using the soil he had enriched with the chemical residues of his hidden processing chamber to buy the total, unyielding moral blindness of his neighbors. He used the very skin of this city to shield his display cases, Dr. Torres stated, her voice trembling slightly as she cataloged the items under the blue glare of the forensic lamps. He knew that as long as he maintained the appearance of a gentle, law-abiding old grandfather, the city would protect his building, the landlords would protect his privacy, and the police would spend decades chasing phantoms down the highway corridors while the true butcher was living right behind the drywall of the master bedroom. The recovery of this hidden underground archive completely transformed the nature of the upcoming prosecution, turning the trial of Arthur Pendleton into a historic, multi-state serial murder and civil infrastructure indictment that would dominate federal crime databases for decades to come. The state prosecutors realized that the public defender teams, which were already attempting to draft motions to suppress the surreptitious coffee mug DNA evidence based on technical chain of custody arguments, would have zero legal footing before a jury. The direct physical possession of the victim's jewelry, stored inside a highly secure, mechanical hidden vault built into the structural chimney of a property leased under his private corporate shell, constituted an absolute, unassailable chain of physical culpability that led straight from the dark history of the 1978 blizzard into the absolute center of his living room. As the technical teams began the slow, agonizing process of vacuum packing every individual bone fragment and glass vial, loading the heavy evidence crates onto the armored state transport trucks parked in the square below, Marcus Vance walked out onto the front stone porch of the brownstone. The heavy river fog was finally beginning to lift over Lincoln Park, the cold spring sun throwing a long, blood-red light across the brick facades of Orchard Street. The neighborhood was silent, its historic charm permanently unblinded, its residents left to look at the walls of their own homes with a new, corrosive paranoia that would contaminate their security for generations to come. The gentle icon of the block had been stripped of his camouflage, his fortress of silence dismantled piece by individual piece, leaving an entire city to sit forever amidst the smoking, unblinded ruins of a domestic faith that had been weaponized against them by the neighbor next door. The mechanical extraction of Cynthia Sterling's remains from the floor joists of Unit 2A did not merely conclude a local cold case, it initiated a profound, systemic institutional collapse across the entire municipal administration of Cook County. By the afternoon of Sunday, April 12, 2026, the psychological shockwave had traveled far beyond the yellow crime scene barriers of North Orchard Street, cutting like a high-voltage current through the historical preservation boards, the housing authorities, and the corporate real estate networks that dictated the development of Chicago's North Side. The community was entering a phase of acute sociopolitical paralysis. It was one thing for an urban center to discover an active serial predator operating within its industrial fringes, but it was an entirely different tier of existential trauma to realize that the ultimate symbol of neighborhood stability, the gentle, silver-haired gardener who had anchored their block since the late 1970s, was a clinical architect of murder who had systematically used the building codes, the tenant laws, and the historical preservation status of his home to secure a 50-year immunity from the law. Inside the executive briefing room at City Hall, the atmosphere was stripped of its standard bureaucratic optimism. The mayor sat at the head of a massive limestone table, her eyes fixed on a confidential structural mapping report delivered by the Illinois Department of Urban Infrastructure and the State Police Special Operations Command. Flanking her were the chief commissioners of building inspections, the head of the Historical Architecture Registry, and the High Command of Area 3 Homicide. The emergency session had been called not to review the legal mechanics of Arthur Pendleton's upcoming prosecution, which was already considered a historical and forensic certainty, but to orchestrate a crisis management protocol for the thousands of residential structures that shared the exact same architectural blueprints as the Orchard Street brownstone. The public is focusing on the tragedy of 1978, but our administrative crisis is structural. The building commissioner stated, his laser pointer illuminating a cross-sectional schematic of a standard late 19th century Chicago red brick tenement block. Arthur Pendleton didn't just find a random void in his apartment. He spent a 30-year career as a certified municipal draft technician mapping the unmonitored dead spaces inside these historic multifamily frames. He knew down to the exact inch where the plumbing chases, the old dumbwaiter shafts, and the load-bearing joist cavities ran through these buildings without ever appearing on modern digital city maps. If this offender was using these internal architectural blind spots to process and store his targets, we have to assume that every historic rental unit he ever surveyed or inhabited over a 40-year career is a potential secondary repository. The immediate economic and logistical fallout was already vibrating through the regional real estate markets. The moment the Cook County State's Attorney's Office formalized the multi-state serial murder indictments, explicitly documenting how Pendleton had utilized his professional draft certifications to construct and reinforce hidden biometric vaults inside his apartment, the local housing authority was forced to issue an unprecedented emergency inspection directive. Major property management corporations and private brownstone owners across Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and Wicker Park were hit with an immediate flood of lease terminations from terrified tenants who could no longer bear to look at the drywall of their master bedrooms without wondering what lay inside the joist framing behind the plaster. While the local property markets scrambled to insulate themselves from the toxic social radiation of the arrest, Dr. Linda Torres and her team of forensic anthropologists were inside the high-security cleanroom suite at the Layton Technology Center, completing the digital decoding of the 32 black leather-bound ledger books recovered from the hidden safe behind the water risers. The volumes were laid out beneath long rows of shortwave ultraviolet lamps, their vintage paper sheets emitting a faint, yellow luminescence as the alignment software scanned the microscopic, handwritten entries. These ledgers represented the true, chilling blueprint of a psychopath's administrative genius, a multi-decade research archive written in a highly complex, alphanumeric shorthand that cataloged the precise physiological and architectural metrics of his secret survival. As Torres translated the technical equations Pendleton had used to log his daily interactions with his environment, she discovered that the killer had treated his neighborhood volunteer work and his gentle, eccentric public persona as a direct investment in physical security. In an entry dated November 14, 1992, 14 years after the slaughterhouse was established inside his living room floor, Pendleton had written, "The City Council approved the Historical Preservation Ordinance for the Orchard Street corridor this afternoon. A marvelous piece of bureaucratic preservation. By securing the landmark status for this building, the municipal inspectors have effectively barred themselves from ever executing any invasive structural or plumbing alterations to my unit without a multi-year administrative review board permission. The preservationists believe they are protecting the historic brickwork of the old city from the greed of modern developers. They do not see that by locking this building into the past, they have turned my floor joists into a state-protected cemetery. The laws of the living are the best mortar for the graves of the dead." The notebooks revealed that every neighborly gesture Pendleton had made over half a century, every bag of organic compost he left on a porch, every tomato plant he tended in the community garden, every conversation he shared with a local mail carrier, had been meticulously calculated to manage the social atmosphere of his block. He had turned the entire neighborhood into an involuntary protective buffer, ensuring that if a weird scent ever escaped a utility chase during a seasonal thaw, or if a mechanical sound ever vibrated through a pipe during a structural repair, the community would immediately rationalize the anomaly as a harmless quirk of an old building or the innocent habit of their beloved elderly neighbor. The psychological devastation experienced by the surviving family members of his wider interstate victim ledger during this week of exposure was a profound, agonizing phenomenon. In a quiet, Winter Strip suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 72-year-old Martha Sterling, the mother of Cynthia and Sterling, who had vanished from an art gallery night in May 1996, sat staring at the digitized images of the clear glass specimen jars recovered from the Orchard Street safe. For 30 long years, Martha had been forced to live under the crushing weight of an unresolved mystery, her daughter's disappearance classified by local Wisconsin law enforcement as a cold migratory runaway case, an assumption that had left the family to simmer in a toxic soup of mutual guilt and permanent administrative silence. They told us she wanted to disappear, Martha told Special Agent Marcus Vance during an evening video briefing, her voice breaking into a thin, dry whisper as she looked at the photograph of the distinctive enamel earring that had been pulled from the titanium safe. We spent 3 decades looking at every young woman on the highway, looking at every transit bus passing through the state, wondering if she was living a new life under a different name. We never imagined that her life had been packed into a glass vial inside a luxury apartment in Chicago, while the man who took her was smiling at children and helping his neighbors grow flowers. The absolute horror is that his respectability was bought with the pieces of our children's lives, and the city was happy to let him buy it because he was the perfect old man for their block. The process of stripping Arthur Pendleton's presence from the historic fabric of Lincoln Park began with a frantic, silent urgency that looked to the public like an act of profound community cleansing, but was recognized by the surveillance teams as a desperate attempt by local institutions to erase the evidence of their own profound blindness. At the Orchard Street Community Garden, a site he had managed since 1985, municipal workers arrived at dawn with heavy excavation machinery, working behind a canvas screen to systematically tear up the raised wooden vegetable beds, excavate 3 feet of dark, organic topsoil, and load the dirt into biohazard transport containers. The neighborhood could not bear to look at the ground that had been curated by his hands, knowing that the rich fertilizer he used had been processed inside the same basement utility closet where Diane Vance's life had been dismantled. Yet, as the physical traces of his lifestyle were scraped clean from the soil, the legal battlefield was forming an iron-tight line of containment. Julian Vance's newly retained Public Defense Consortium, a team composed of the state's top constitutional scholars, procedural forensic experts, and high-velocity trial attorneys, had launched a massive, multi-tiered judicial offensive. They flooded the Circuit Court of Cook County with over 40 motions demanding the immediate, total suppression of the surreptitious coffee mug DNA evidence harvested from the Century Lounge, claiming that Special Agent Marcus Vance had executed an illegal, unconstitutional seizure of a private citizen's biological property without a prior judicial warrant. They argued with an unyielding, technical ferocity that the porcelain rim cell sample was an inadmissible piece of genetic data, stolen by state operatives using advanced magnification lenses inside a private commercial establishment, and that the subsequent recorded confessions and the joist exhumation were nothing but the fruit of a poisonous tree. They were attempting to use the historic Fourth Amendment protections designed to shield the privacy of ordinary citizens from government tyranny to erect a final, technical wall around a serial killer's museum. But the state prosecutors remained unmoving, secure in the knowledge that the dual-track forensic testing protocol, the absolute, mathematical identity convergence between the high-density SNP mapping and the physical recovery of Cynthia Sterling's skeletal remains beneath his own living room floorboards, had created a legal knot that no procedural motion could ever unravel. As the weekend arrived, bringing with it a bitter, gray sleet that turned the sidewalks of North Orchard Street into frozen ribbons of ice, Special Agent Marcus Vance stood outside the heavy iron gates of number 1422. The excavation was entering its final, structural phase. The heavy utility vans were preparing to transport the last crates of ledger books and resin shields back to the central evidence vault. The red brick building stood dark and silent against the winter sky, its arched windows reflecting the cold yellow glow of the historic gas lamps below. The domestic sanity that had defined Lincoln Park for nearly half a century had been permanently deconstructed, its architecture exposed as nothing more than the engineered shell of an untraceable tomb, leaving a terrified city to sit forever amidst the smoking, unblinded ruins of a neighborhood faith that had been weaponized against them by the old man next door.